Hey, we've now added a ton of content to the portfolio app. But one last thing that's really sticking out is how bare bones the site still looks. So let's wrap up this overall project in this section by picking off some low-hanging styling fruit to make this app look a lot better. Let me say that this course is going to keep the time spent on CSS to the absolute minimum. That's why this styling video is the last one in the section. I think it's more beneficial personally to spend time on deep dives into React code, since that's the topic of the overall course. But that being said, CS work is going to be done when necessary. You can't ignore styling forever when it comes to front end after all. Okay, first we're going to add an index.css file to the project under the public directory. So add an index.css file to public. One of the first things that we can do in CSS is to target elements and then change how they appear based off of properties. So for example, we can target the body element and say that within the body, we're going to make the text align go to the center by having a text align property whose value is now center. When you have a property in CSS, make sure you finish the line with a semicolon. Likewise, we can change the default font size and we can make it 20 pixels, also have the semicolon. And then the padding for the body element, which provides an inner spacing around the entire border, we're going to make it 2.5%. So that way nothing in the body is actually touching the edges. Now, this should already have a huge effect on the application, but we still need to include the CSS within the app. The traditional way to do this is with a style sheet link in the HTML file. So head to index.html. In the head section, after the title, let's provide a link tag. And the relationship of this link is a style sheet within the HTML. Then we provide the reference, the hyperlink reference to the CSS with an href attribute, to which we provide the index.css file. All right, go ahead and give that a save. And as long as you have npm run start going in the portfolio directory in the terminal, you're going to find that the application at localhost 3000 has now drastically changed. Everything is in the center now. Nothing is touching the edges. Also, the font is probably bigger than what you remember it to be. Cool. Now, we can actually use an alternative way to include the CSS that is a little more typical with a React application. Instead of providing a link in the HTML file, we can directly include the CSS within our JavaScript by doing an import of the CSS itself. However, rather than reaching all the way into the public directory, let's make the index.css local to the source index.js file by moving it to the source directory itself. And now within here, we can import the local index.css file. This now means within index.html, we should take out that link rel style sheet of index.css because we're now using this import of /index.css directly in the JavaScript. Now, as you save that, you'll find that in the application on the browser, in the reload, those changes are definitely still there. Now, when it comes to building React applications, the approach of importing CSS into your JavaScript is definitely preferred. The reason is that you can get more granular with your CSS, meaning you can include individual CSS files for each component if you wanted. For example, we could have an app.css, a projects.css, and a social profiles.css to style each one of those components individually. But by using a global link tag within your HTML, the traditional way, it encourages this pattern where all your CSS ends up in one giant index.css file. Now, granted, we won't be creating a ton of CSS classes in this project anyway, so it's fine to write all the styling within index.css, but it's good to be aware of this pattern of including CSS as a resource directly in your JavaScript. Cool. Next, let's go to one of the most reliable tricks in the book when it comes to styling, and that's to use pre-made styling on the cloud. Head back to the browser and look up Bootstrap Getting Started in another tab. You're going to find this Getting Started Bootstrap link, and within here, when you go down, you'll find a latest compiled and minified CSS link tag. Go ahead and copy that. And once you have that, head back to the index.html file. And we can actually include this after the title attribute. So it's that long link style, but go ahead and have that latest compiled and minified CSS from the Bootstrap CDN, which is an online place where they're hosting this CSS file. All right, in the application now, you're going to find that with this new link, that it definitely looks different. The text is a bit different, and especially the button layout is different than before. Cool. So that can quickly apply some changes to your application to make it look a lot better in as quick as 2 seconds. Now, one thing about Bootstrap is that these fonts actually aren't my favorite. So one thing that I always like to do for any project is to pick my own fonts. My go-to resource for that is fonts.google.com. And here you're going to find a bunch of fonts that you can include so quick within your application. You click one of these plus buttons, you expand the font, and there's a link tag for you to include right within your HTML. Feel free to pause here and find your own fonts. However, I have a couple pre-chosen that I think look really slick. They're called Economica and Roboto Condense, which are both fonts used heavily by Google throughout their products. They're also located in the portfolio source assets directory of the official course repo. So if you head back to github.com/15cats/React Bootcamp, you're going to find in the portfolio source assets directory that those TTF files for Economica Bold and Roboto Condense.light are there. So you can download those here, or they should also be available in the resources section of this lecture. So go ahead and grab those and make sure you have them in the source assets directory, and you might have already included them in a previous lecture. But once you have those files within source assets, head back to index.css. And now we can apply the fonts in our CSS. In here, we can define global font faces for the application. By declaring a font face with the @fontface keyword, we can make a new font family that is based on the font file within our assets directory. So let's call this first one Roboto Condensed. And we need to give it a URL, or rather a source, that uses a URL function to go into the assets directory. And this one is going to use the roboto-condensed.light.ttf file. The font weight for this one by default is going to be 800, which is right in the middle of its various font weights. And we're going to do the same thing for the second font. And this font family is going to be called Economica Bold. Its source is the URL of assets/economica-bold.ttf. In this one, the default font is going to be just fine, so let's not change the font weight. Okay, now that we have these font faces defined, we can apply them as font families within elements throughout our CSS classes. For example, in the body, we can make the font family for this one Roboto Condensed. Likewise, we can target other kinds of elements. For example, we can target the H1, H2, H3, H4, and H5 header elements and say that the font family for each of these is going to be Economica Bold. All right, make sure to have a semicolon after each of these lines. But after this change, if you look at the application once you save the file, you're going to find that, well, it looks a lot better with those custom fonts. Cool. So as one very last change, let's add a profile image to the project. After all, this is a personal portfolio application, and it doesn't seem right without a profile picture. I definitely recommend using one of your own profile images, but just in case, once again, you can go to source assets and then find a profile.png which you can use. It's best to have one with even dimensions, so 400 by 400 width and height. And now within the app.js file, let's import the profile as a resource. So let's import the profile from .assets/profile.png. And at the top of the render method, we can provide an image tag to now render this profile. So let's provide the image. Its source is profile. Since this is an image element, we're also going to want to give it an alt attribute, and let's call it the profile as the alternate in case the image can't load. In the browser, go ahead and check out the application, and yep, there it is, the giant image profile. Let's go ahead and shorten this down, make it smaller with some styling. And instead of a style attribute this time, let's actually give it a CSS class name. So that way we can use the index.css file to change it. So that way you know how to do that in case you ever want to use your CSS file to make changes to specific elements or components within your application. Now, the way to do that in HTML is to provide a class attribute to the actual element. However, notice that class is already a reserved keyword in JavaScript. So in JSX, if you want to apply a class, you actually use the class name. And let's make the class name profile. So now this image element is associated with the CSS profile class name, which means that we can target it within the index.css to have a dot profile class. And the dot represents the fact that we're using a class name for the element. Within here, we can change the width to 200 pixels. We can also change the height to 200 pixels. And then we can apply the border radius property to give it some rounded edges. So for example, we can give it a rounded edge of 5 pixels. But if we set this border radius to exactly half of the width and height, well, it'll turn it into a perfect circle. All right, go ahead and check back in the application once you have those changes. And in the app, well, you should find the profile is smaller and it's an exact circle. Neat. Overall, that wraps up the low-hanging styling fruit, and the app is looking a lot better thanks to our CSS changes. And that actually completes the first part of developing this portfolio application. We've explored components, state, props, and got quite a bit of experience coding in React. Now it's time to take a step back and look at the big picture of how React fits in overall web development. We're going to take a look under the hood of React, figure out how the engine works, and more. All right, see you in the next one. If you enjoy this content, head to davidtkatz.com. There, you'll find links to full courses, as well as to reach out and connect with me. For React and Redux in particular, you'll want to check out udemy.com/React Redux Bootcamp. This is a course I made to help you learn React and Redux the right way, and to turn you into React and Redux developer. Okay, see you in the next one.